Most people think men leave relationships because they don't care. But what if the truth is far more uncomfortable? What if men don't walk away because they feel nothing, but because they feel too much and were never taught how to hold it? Today, we're talking about how trauma silently shapes men in relationships and why love becomes the battlefield where their deepest wounds finally surface. Stay with me because this might change how you see men forever. Men don't lack emotions. They were taught to suppress them, and that conditioning begins far earlier than most people realize. From childhood, boys are subtly and explicitly rewarded for emotional restraint and punished for emotional expression. A boy who cries is told to be strong, to toughen up, to stop being dramatic. A boy who shows fear is mocked. A boy who shows sadness is dismissed, and a boy who shows sensitivity is quickly taught that those traits make him vulnerable to shame. Over time, the message becomes internalized. Emotions are dangerous. Emotions make you weak. Emotions cost you respect. So instead of learning how to process feelings, men learn how to manage appearances, how to mask discomfort, how to translate emotional pain into something more socially acceptable like silence, anger, or detachment. This isn't emotional absence, it's emotional survival. What often gets misunderstood is that suppression doesn't erase emotions, it simply forces them underground. Feelings that are not expressed do not disappear, they accumulate. When men are denied the language to name what they feel, their emotions come out sideways. Sadness becomes irritability, fear becomes control, insecurity becomes emotional withdrawal. Many men grow up never being asked how they feel, only how they perform. Their value becomes tied to productivity, strength, and usefulness rather than emotional presence. As adults, they may genuinely struggle to articulate what's happening inside them, not because they are indifferent, but because no one ever taught them how to sit with vulnerability without shame. In relationships, this suppression creates a deep internal conflict. Intimacy requires openness, but openness feels unsafe to someone who learned early that emotions lead to rejection or ridicule. So men may love deeply while simultaneously keeping emotional distance. They may want closeness, yet feel overwhelmed by it. When a partner asks for emotional connection, it can trigger a sense of inadequacy rather than a desire to bond. Not knowing how to express emotions doesn't mean they aren't there. It means the emotional system was never given permission to develop in a healthy way. Many men feel intensely but quietly, privately, often in isolation. This suppression is also why men are frequently misunderstood as emotionally unavailable. What looks like coldness is often confusion. What looks like indifference is often emotional overload. When feelings finally surface, they may come out explosively or in moments that seem disproportionate to the situation because suppressed emotions don't emerge gently. They erupt when the pressure becomes too much. Men aren't taught how to regulate emotions, only how to contain them, and containment has a limit. The emotional system eventually demands to be acknowledged, whether through stress, anger, withdrawal, or burnout. The tragedy is that many men believe something is wrong with them for feeling deeply while being unable to express it. They internalize the idea that they are emotionally broken or defective, when in reality they were emotionally neglected by a culture that confused suppression with strength. Emotional literacy was never offered to them, yet they are expected to suddenly possess it in adulthood. This gap creates loneliness even in relationships because feeling misunderstood is more painful than feeling alone, and carrying emotions without language can feel like carrying weight without knowing where to put it. Unhealed trauma rarely announces itself in obvious ways. It disguises itself through patterns that seem ordinary on the surface, but are deeply rooted in past pain. Emotional distance, anger, and control are not random personality traits. They are protective responses formed in moments when someone felt unsafe, powerless, or unseen. When trauma is left unprocessed, the nervous system remains in a constant state of alert, scanning for threats that may no longer exist. In relationships, this hypervigilance creates distance because closeness once came with harm. Emotional withdrawal becomes a shield, a way to stay connected without fully exposing oneself. The person may appear cold or detached, but internally there is often a fear that intimacy will lead to disappointment, betrayal, or loss, so distance becomes the safest compromise. Anger is another common expression of unhealed trauma, especially when vulnerability was never allowed. Many people were taught that sadness or fear were unacceptable emotions, but anger was tolerated or even encouraged. Over time, anger becomes the default response to emotional discomfort. It provides a sense of power where there was once helplessness. In relationships, this can show up as irritability, defensiveness, or explosive reactions over seemingly small issues. The anger is rarely about the present moment. It is the emotional residue of past experiences that were never processed. Each argument, each perceived slight unconsciously reactivates old wounds, and the body responds as if it is reliving the original pain rather than addressing the current situation. Control is perhaps the most misunderstood expression of trauma. It often develops in environments where chaos, unpredictability, or emotional neglect were present. When someone grows up feeling that their emotional safety depends on external circumstances, they learn to manage their anxiety by managing their surroundings. In adult relationships, this can manifest as rigidity, micromanagement, emotional manipulation, or a need to dominate decisions. Control is not about power over others. It is about attempting to regulate internal fear. The more unsafe a person feels internally, the more they try to control externally. This creates tension in relationships because control suffocates intimacy while simultaneously being driven by a fear of losing it. These patterns can exist simultaneously, creating confusion for both the individual and their partner. Someone may be emotionally distant, yet deeply reactive, controlling yet afraid of abandonment. This contradiction is the hallmark of unhealed trauma. The person is not choosing these behaviors consciously. They are operating from learned survival strategies that once kept them safe. The problem is that strategies designed for survival often sabotage connection. They protect the individual from pain, but they also prevent genuine closeness, emotional safety, and mutual trust. Unhealed trauma keeps people stuck in cycles where the past dictates present behavior. Without awareness, emotional distance becomes habit, anger becomes identity, and control becomes routine. The body continues to respond to relationships as if they are threats rather than opportunities for connection. What appears as difficult behavior is often a nervous system that has never learned how to feel safe in closeness, how to tolerate vulnerability without fear, or how to trust that intimacy does not always lead to harm. Men often relive childhood wounds through romantic relationships because early emotional experiences shape how safety, love, and connection are understood long before adulthood begins. The relationship a boy has with caregivers teaches him what to expect from closeness, whether love feels conditional or secure, whether needs are met or ignored, whether affection is consistent or unpredictable. These early patterns don't disappear with age, they become internal templates. When a man enters a romantic relationship, his nervous system is not responding only to his partner in the present, but also to unresolved emotional memories from the past. What feels like a simple disagreement or moment of distance can unconsciously mirror the emotional environment he grew up in, activating old fears and unmet needs. If a man experienced emotional neglect as a child, he may be especially sensitive to perceived withdrawal in a partner. Even small moments of silence or independence can feel like abandonment, triggering anxiety or emotional shutdown. If love once felt uncertain, he may constantly seek reassurance or, paradoxically, push intimacy away to avoid the pain of potential rejection. Romantic relationships become the stage where these unresolved dynamics replay, not because he wants to relive the pain, but because the nervous system is drawn to what it recognizes. Familiar pain feels safer than unfamiliar peace, and the subconscious often mistakes intensity for intimacy. Men who grew up in environments where emotions were dismissed or minimized may struggle deeply with emotional expression in adulthood. When a partner asks for vulnerability, it can evoke the same helplessness they felt as children when their emotions were ignored. Instead of responding to the present request, they respond to the memory of being unheard. This can lead to defensiveness, emotional withdrawal, or frustration, even when the partner's intention is connection. The relationship becomes emotionally charged because it touches wounds that were never healed, only buried. Each interaction carries the weight of earlier experiences, making it difficult to stay grounded in the present moment. For men who experienced inconsistent caregiving, romantic relationships can feel unstable even when they are not. They may alternate between craving closeness and fearing it, recreating the push and pull dynamic they learned early in life. When love was unpredictable, the body learns to stay alert, to brace for disappointment. This hyper-awareness often shows up as jealousy, control, or emotional testing, behaviors that are attempts to gain certainty in a world that once felt emotionally unsafe. The partner may feel confused by these reactions, unaware that they are witnessing the resurfacing of childhood wounds rather than reactions to current behavior. Romantic relationships carry a unique emotional intensity because they involve attachment, vulnerability, and dependence, elements that closely resemble childhood bonds. For men, these relationships unconsciously reopen unfinished emotional chapters. The desire to be chosen, valued, and emotionally seen mirrors childhood longings that were never fulfilled. When a partner meets these needs inconsistently or unknowingly triggers old pain, the emotional response is often disproportionate because it is layered with years of suppressed emotion. The adult relationship becomes a container for unresolved grief, unmet needs, and unprocessed loss, playing out in real time through arguments, distance, or emotional confusion. Fear of vulnerability makes love feel unsafe because vulnerability requires exposure, and exposure is threatening to anyone who learned early that openness leads to pain. For many men, vulnerability was not met with care or understanding, but with criticism, dismissal, or punishment. Showing emotion may have resulted in being shamed, ignored, or made to feel weak, so the nervous system learned to associate emotional openness with danger. Over time, this creates a deeply ingrained belief that to be seen fully is to be at risk. Love, which demands emotional presence and honesty, then becomes something that feels destabilizing rather than comforting. When vulnerability feels unsafe, emotional walls become necessary for survival. Men may appear guarded, distant, or emotionally unavailable, not because they lack the desire for connection, but because closeness activates fear. Love invites intimacy, and intimacy requires letting someone see parts of the self that were once rejected or ridiculed. This fear can cause men to keep relationships on a surface level, avoiding deep emotional conversations or deflecting with humor, logic, or silence. They may share facts about their lives but withhold feelings, maintaining control by staying emotionally protected. The avoidance of vulnerability becomes a way to prevent emotional injury. Fear of vulnerability also creates confusion in relationships because it often coexists with a genuine desire for connection. Men may crave closeness while simultaneously feeling overwhelmed by it. When a partner expresses emotional needs, it can trigger anxiety rather than empathy because those needs feel like demands for exposure. Even healthy emotional intimacy can feel intrusive when vulnerability has historically led to harm. This internal conflict often results in mixed signals, pulling someone close one moment, then pushing them away the next, leaving both partners feeling uncertain and disconnected. Love requires trust, but fear of vulnerability undermines trust at its core. Trust means believing that someone will not use your openness against you, but past experiences can make that belief feel unrealistic. Men who were betrayed, emotionally neglected, or shamed in early relationships may struggle to believe that safety is possible in love. They may anticipate rejection before it happens, emotionally bracing themselves for loss. This anticipation shapes behavior, leading to emotional withdrawal, self-sabotage, or an unwillingness to fully commit. The relationship becomes less about shared growth and more about emotional self-preservation. The inability to be vulnerable also limits emotional intimacy. Without vulnerability, connection remains incomplete because emotional safety is built through mutual openness. When men suppress vulnerability, they often suppress their needs, fears, and insecurities, creating emotional distance even in close relationships. Their partners may sense something is missing, but struggle to understand what it is. The fear of being seen keeps love at arm's length, turning what could be a source of comfort into a source of tension. Love feels unsafe not because it is harmful, but because the emotional system has never learned how to experience closeness without fear. Trauma creates defensive patterns, not character flaws, yet these patterns are often misunderstood as permanent traits rather than temporary adaptations. When someone experiences emotional pain that overwhelms their ability to cope, the mind and body respond by developing strategies to stay safe. These strategies are not chosen consciously, they are shaped in moments of vulnerability when protection was necessary. Over time, these responses become ingrained, turning into habits that persist long after the original threat has passed. What once served as survival mechanisms begin to define behavior, leading others to label the person as distant, aggressive, controlling, or emotionally unavailable, without recognizing that these behaviors were learned in response to harm. Defensive patterns form because trauma disrupts a person's sense of safety. When trust is broken early in life or through significant experiences, the nervous system adapts by staying on guard. This hyper-awareness influences how relationships are approached, how emotions are expressed, and how conflict is handled. Avoidance may develop as a way to prevent further pain, while emotional shutdown can protect against overwhelming feelings. These behaviors are not reflections of a flawed personality. They are the body's attempt to regulate distress. Trauma teaches the individual that openness is risky, so defensiveness becomes the default mode of interaction. One of the most damaging misconceptions is the belief that these patterns reflect who a person truly is. In reality, they reflect what the person has been through. Trauma can narrow emotional responses, limiting flexibility and spontaneity. Someone may appear rigid or emotionally closed off, not because they lack depth, but because their emotional system is operating under perceived threat. Defensive patterns can make it difficult to form secure connections as they prioritize safety over intimacy. The individual may struggle to respond authentically in relationships, relying instead on automatic reactions shaped by past experiences. These patterns often persist because they are reinforced by misunderstanding. When defensive behaviors are met with criticism or rejection, it confirms the original belief that vulnerability is unsafe. This reinforcement strengthens the defense, making it harder to break the cycle. The person may internalize negative labels, believing they are broken or incapable of change. This self-perception can be more damaging than the trauma itself, as it creates hopelessness and discourages healing. Trauma does not strip a person of their capacity for growth. It simply distorts how they protect themselves. Understanding trauma as the root of defensive patterns shifts the focus from blame to awareness. Recognizing that these behaviors are learned responses allows space for compassion without excusing harm. Defensive patterns can be unlearned, but only when safety is reestablished and self-awareness is developed. Healing involves understanding the origin of these behaviors and gradually replacing them with healthier responses. Trauma shapes behavior, but it does not define identity, and beneath defensive patterns exists a person capable of connection, resilience, and emotional depth. Healing requires accountability, not blame or avoidance, because growth begins the moment a person takes responsibility for their inner world. Accountability is not about self-punishment or shame. It is about recognizing how past experiences influence present behavior and choosing to respond differently. Trauma may explain emotional reactions, but healing only starts when someone acknowledges the impact of their actions on themselves and others. Avoidance delays this process, allowing old patterns to repeat unchecked. Blame, whether directed inward or outward, keeps a person stuck in the past, focused on what happened rather than on what can be changed. Blaming others for emotional pain can feel comforting because it offers temporary relief from responsibility. It allows someone to remain in the role of the wounded party without confronting the work required to heal. However, blame strips a person of agency. When healing is outsourced to circumstances or people who cause the pain, control is lost over one's own growth. Accountability restores that control. It shifts the focus from who hurt you to how you are responding to that hurt now. This shift is essential because while the past cannot be altered, present behavior can be transformed. Avoidance is another barrier to healing that often disguises itself as strength or independence. Suppressing emotions, dismissing pain, or distracting oneself from discomfort may provide short-term relief, but it prevents emotional integration. Unprocessed experiences do not fade. They remain active beneath the surface, influencing reactions and decisions. Avoidance keeps the nervous system in a constant state of defense, reinforcing fear rather than resolving it. Healing requires facing uncomfortable emotions directly, allowing them to be acknowledged without judgment. Accountability means staying present with discomfort instead of escaping it. Taking accountability also means recognizing patterns that no longer serve you. This includes acknowledging how unresolved pain may lead to emotional withdrawal, defensiveness, or harm toward others. It is easier to justify these behaviors by pointing to trauma than it is to confront their consequences. True healing does not deny the pain of the past, but it also does not allow that pain to dictate the future. Accountability bridges this gap by honoring past wounds while committing to healthier responses. It involves self-reflection, honesty, and a willingness to change ingrained habits. Healing is not a passive process. It requires conscious effort and emotional courage. Accountability creates the conditions for growth by encouraging ownership without self-condemnation. It allows space for compassion while maintaining responsibility for one's actions. When blame and avoidance are released, healing becomes an active choice rather than a distant hope. This process fosters resilience, emotional maturity, and deeper self-awareness, enabling individuals to build relationships rooted in honesty rather than defense, and presence rather than fear. When we talk about men, trauma, and relationships, the goal is not to assign guilt or create division. It is to bring clarity to patterns that have long been misunderstood and silently normalized. Emotional distance, anger, control, and fear of vulnerability are not random flaws. They are learned responses shaped by environments where emotional safety was missing. Understanding this shifts the narrative from judgment to awareness, from labeling to listening. It allows us to see behavior not as proof of a broken person, but as evidence of unresolved pain asking to be acknowledged. Healing is not about rewriting the past, but about refusing to let it continue unconsciously. Relationships do not create trauma, they reveal it. They become mirrors that expose what was never healed, never processed, never given space to exist. When men begin to recognize these patterns within themselves, they gain the power to interrupt cycles that would otherwise repeat across relationships and generations. Awareness becomes the first act of responsibility, and responsibility becomes the doorway to change. True emotional strength is not found in suppression, avoidance, or control. It is found in self-honesty, emotional accountability, and the courage to face discomfort without running from it. When men learn to understand their inner world rather than fear it, love no longer feels like a threat. It becomes a space for growth, safety, and connection, where intimacy is no longer something to survive, but something to experience fully.